Oh yeah, it's just getting good. This part two of From Chinos to Indians. Let's go.
Peoples of the Philippines. Okay. Meanwhile, in America, indigenous people were also being reclassified as Negroes and forced to work on plantations. Now, I'm going to use an example from the article titled The Use of Terms Negro and Black to Include Persons of Native American Ancestry in Anglo-North America by Jack D. Forbes. Quote, Negro was also used in a general way in the North American colonies. Some examples illustrate the use of Negro and Black as applied to people of American ancestry. An example is from the West Indies, is especially illuminating. In 1764, William Young was sent to St. Vincent as a part of the British occupation of that island. Living on St. Vincent were about 3,000 Black Caribs or free Negroes, about 100 Red Caribs or Indians, and some 4,000 French and their slaves, according to Young. The British found it difficult to control the Caribs, and wars were fought with them in 1771 through 1772, and again during 1795 through 1796. During the latter crisis, Young wrote an extremely anti-Carib tract designed to prove that the Caribs should be removed from St. Vincent. They were eventually defeated, and some 5,000 Caribs were shipped to an island near the coast of Honduras. Young was anxious to prove that the so-called Black Caribs were not Aborigines, but were in fact Negro colonists, freed Negroes, or Negro usurpers. This was important to him because he wanted to show they had no bona fide land rights or Aboriginal title. This tendency continues, incidentally, amongst white scholars who even today refuse to accept the Caribs' avowed feelings of Indianness and continues to call them Black. Now, this is what happened and what they still do today. Okay, so at that time, the indigenous people were fighting and were being reclassified as Negro and Black, and there were some lighter skinned native peoples who were helping them. Okay, I'm gonna read a section from the book Asian Slaves in Colonial Mexico. And this is about another way that was completely a reclassification, or what we would call a genocide on indigenous people through reclassification. Okay, so this is from the page 110 in Asian Slaves in Colonial Mexico. All right. So, quote, the devastating demographic collapse of the indigenous population in the 16th century transformed the labor system in Mexico. The drop in population was almost inconceivable. Approximately 15 million native people lost their lives between the 1530s and 1608 in central Mexico. So you mean to tell me in less than 100 years, 15 million native people died, they lost their lives or were killed, all right? And this is not to make light of the situation or to poke fun at it, but what I'm saying is that all of these people that they reclassified as Negroes, as African slaves, a lot of those people were indigenous people. But it makes it look like there was a complete slaughter or genocide of indigenous people when you just reclassify them. Then you can say they're all dead. But no, they're not dead. They've just been reclassified. They were reclassified by the pen. Okay? And we see that this actually happened with the Karankawas, and it happened with the Yamasee people as well. All right? Now, let me get back to the next part. All right. Now that dark-skinned Aboriginals lost the war against the Spanish Crown and now Spanish America, they were then reclassified as Negroes and Africans. The lighter-skinned Native people who helped subdue the Aboriginal people were allowed to maintain their indigenous status, but they were still considered subjects or slaves of the Spanish Crown and forced to endure a lighter form of slavery, which was not nearby as harsh as what the Aboriginal people had to experience. So this is the talking about how the Chino slaves became Indians, all right? The Chino slaves who were brought from the Philippines were people who were used to working underneath the Spaniards, and the Spanish believed that they were easier to control than Negroes who were there. Once in Mexico, they worked in the textile fields, and though they were laborers, they were not forced to work out in the fields like the dark-skinned Aboriginals, and they soon became identified as Indians. Right? Now I want to read to you a section if I can find it. If I can't, then I'm going to just leave it alone. All right? I believe I think I did find it, okay? All right, here we go. Yes. All right, this is from page 109. This is a section from Asian slaves in colonial Mexico. Quote, Chinos were mainly servants because Spanish colonists characterized slaves who came from the Philippines as being more domesticated than black Negroes. The same quality was attributed to Indians who were considered to be naturally obedient and to have an aptness for service. In addition, Chinos were identified as good servants because most of them had some knowledge of Iberian languages, customs, and practices, which they gained in the Spanish Philippines or Portuguese India. This cultural affinity, moreover, encouraged some masters to treat Chino slaves as they did Indians, which meant having slightly more regard for their natural liberty. Right? In addition to personal service, a large number of Chino slaves were employed in textile mills in Mexico City and its environs. Royal officials were particularly vigilant of this urban industry because it was notoriously exploitative of Indian laborers. Chino slaves benefited from this oversight because they were increasingly identified as Indians themselves. Chino slaves thus labored in occupations that enabled them to become free Indians, a status that was eventually confirmed for all Chinos. All right. So this means that when the Chinos were first brought to Mexico, they had already experience of the Spaniard customs, and they knew some of their languages, and they knew that they would be easier to control because their mind had already been domesticated, or what you would say, they had already been brainwashed, to make it simple, okay, that they didn't fear them having an uprising because they felt like they had already conquered them. So they were able to just come in and kind of amalgamate themselves with the Indians. And as time went on, they began to be seen as Indians and treated as Indians. All right. Now I'm going to give you an example of how a Chino slave became an Indian. All right. This is from the book Asian Slaves in Colonial Mexico. Quote, as in Iberia, the capture and sale of Muslims was permitted under canon and secular law. in 1570 and again in 1620, the king declared that it was legal to enslave Muslims in the Philippines. 2 Spaniards testified that Bartolome was indeed a slave because he was a son of Maria Convexo, a Muslim slave.